man from the Swindon area who was abused by his wife for more than 10 years has been speaking to me of his horrific ordeal for the very first time. 4 months ago, Paul Chivers' now ex-wife was sentenced to 16 months in prison. It's after he reported her to the police when she hit him over the head with a hairdryer, leaving him with head injuries requiring hospital treatment. So I've been speaking to Paul, and I started by asking him to tell us more about what had happened to him.
I am the victim of domestic abuse in its many shapes and forms, basically. Physical, mental, emotional. And that was over the course of over 10 years. It took forms like being locked out of my house over 60 times, culminating with sort of things being broken in the house, and also attacks on myself. In March 2014, my ex-wife attacked me and split my head open, which meant I needed to go to hospital, and I ended up with 8 staples in my head. That was the turning point, and it was at that point that I decided that this was enough.
How long were you married for?
We were married for just over 11 years.
And when did the abuse begin in your married life?
More or less from the very beginning.
Was there any sign of this side of your wife's nature before you got married?
No, not really. There were one or two, strange things that happened. But really, it was once we'd got married that she sort of systematically cut me off from my family and from my friends.
And was there a trigger point for this to start? Was there a reason that this began?
The main trigger point from her perspective, as she saw it, was the wedding day itself, and it wasn't as she envisaged it, but as she wanted it. And then she started to categorically blame all of my friends for it, and then my family, and then myself, and that then became an excuse to cut us off from those people.
And did the abuse get worse as the marriage continued?
Yes, it got worse in different ways. Very sort of controlling behaviour. Even sort of, a man in his 30s, 40s, being dictated to as to what time to go to bed, those sorts of things. What I could do, who I could see. Restricting my family life with my parents and my brother to an extent where I felt as though I couldn't actually contact them at all because it would be used against me, and the fallout from my ex-wife knowing anything about that really wasn't worth bothering with.
And at what point into the relationship did the abuse become physical?
It became physical more after our daughter was born. That became more noticeable. Things like windows being broken, me being sort of left on the curbside in 2 or 3 different locations without any cash cards or anything of any means of actually getting myself home.
She would just drive off and leave you?
Yeah. There was one instance where we were out for a day at Burnham-on-Sea, and I just got left there, and she took my wallet off of me, and I had no way of getting home.
What about the abuse becoming physical by way of attacking you?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of events where I've had keys thrust into my chest, car keys. I've had a painting taken down from the wall, and I was hit around the head with it, and the glass cut my hands. And then obviously the events of March 2014.
After your ex-wife had physically assaulted you, did she ever show any remorse for what she'd done in the immediate aftermath?
None whatsoever, and to my knowledge, not even now.
So you were there, you were bleeding badly, you were hurt, she'd hurt you, but she showed no remorse?
No, I mean, it was obvious I had a bad head injury because, blood was pouring from my head. I had to try and stem the flow of blood, so I wrapped a towel from my head. That was inadequate, and it was at that point I felt I needed to get myself to hospital.
Well, we'll hear more from Paul later in the programme this morning, more in around half an hour's time, and then again just after 8 o'clock. We'll also hear what he did.
Tried to make a chocolate
Story on the programme is that a man from the Swindon area who was physically, emotionally and mentally abused by his wife for over a decade is speaking out for the first time. Paul Chivers' now ex-wife was sentenced to 16 months in prison 4 months ago. It's after he'd been the victim of domestic violence for over 10 years. Now, earlier on the programme, he told me how he was locked out of his home over 60 times. He was attacked. He suffered head injuries when she hit him over the head with a hairdryer. He needed 8 staples in his head under hospital treatment. Well, let's get more from Paul's story now. I asked him at what point he accepted that he was being abused.
Quite early on. And it's one of those things that I would say to other people that are in a similar situation, that it is incredibly difficult, but to help yourself, you need to share it with family and friends, so it doesn't come as a complete and utter shock to anybody that know you well.
You know, it's so often you hear of people, men and women, who've been in situations like yours, and people will often say afterwards, why did you stay in that situation? Why didn't you take yourself out of the situation?
I've been asked that many times, and I think, firstly, there are family ties that you want to make things work, particularly if children are involved. There's also the financial side as well. I mean, you've got 2 incomes and you're living a certain standard of life. And in a way, you talk yourself into it. I had to explain to a lot of my friends and family early on that it wasn't going to be like it used to be. In a way, I was cutting myself off, but the reasons why I was doing it was to try and keep my family together.
At what point, though, did you decide enough? I can't carry on like this.
Yeah. It was quite literally a blow to the head. It was the events of March 2014. I think, it's a scary thing to think is possibly if that hadn't happened, I could still be in the same situation. It's amazing what you can put up with. And it does, no matter what people think about, victims of domestic abuse, it's not really a sign of weakness to live in it. I think it's a sign of strength because you have to put up with so much.
When you decided, right, I need to stop this, where did you go? Where did you look to try and get help?
Firstly, I went directly to the police after the events of 2014, and they actually, through the whole process of this, has changed my view of the police. They were very supportive of me as the victim.
That must have been a huge thing to do, though, to actually just go and pick up the telephone.
Yeah.
Because you knew that once you dialed that number, once you got through to the police, there was no going back.
No, there was no going back at all. And lots of those things do pass through your mind, but it had got to such a critical stage. I mean, I couldn't have had a, bigger signal in front of me to do something now than what had happened that night. And it's been a very, very difficult year and a half for me and my family members, but I don't regret doing it.
What happened you made the phone call, you dialed 101. Talk me through the conversation.
Basically, I reported that I'd been assaulted in that way, and I'd been to the hospital, and I'd spent 4.5 hours waiting to be treated in the hospital. Like everybody else at the weekend, it's pretty slow down there. And basically then an arrangement was made for me, I think the following day, to go and speak to somebody at the police station.
Paul Chivers talking exclusively to me at BBC Wiltshire about the abuse that he suffered from his now ex-wife over a period of a decade. His wife was sentenced to 16 months in prison 4 months ago. And we'll hear more from Paul's story, and importantly, we'll get his advice for you. If listening to Paul this morning, you recognise that you are in a similar situation. What help is there out there for you? What should you do? Well, we'll get advice from Paul after 8 o'clock. Programme today, we've been hearing the terrifying ordeal of a man from the Swindon area who was the victim of domestic violence by his wife for over 10 years. He's been speaking out for the first time exclusively to BBC Wiltshire. During Paul Chivers' marriage, he suffered physical, emotional and mental abuse. He went to the police last year after his wife attacked him with a hairdryer, requiring hospital treatment and 8 staples in his head. In a moment, we'll hear how Paul's doing now and get some advice for you if you find yourself in a similar situation. But first, let's just remind you of what he went through.
I am the victim of domestic abuse in its many shapes and forms, basically. Physical, mental, emotional. And that was over the course of over 10 years. It took forms like being locked out of my house over 60 times, culminating with sort of things being broken in the house, and also attacks on myself. In March 2014, my ex-wife attacked me and split my head open, which meant I needed to go to hospital, and I ended up with 8 staples in my head. That was the turning point, and it was at that point that I decided that this was enough.
That's Paul Chivers, the victim of domestic violence at the hands of his wife for over a decade. Well, his now ex-wife is in prison. Back in April, she was sentenced to 16 months. And I asked Paul what offences she was convicted for.
Grievous bodily harm and common assault. The grievous bodily harm was for the attack that left me with 8 staples in my head, and the common assault was for the attack the morning after.
Do you know whether she accepts responsibility for her actions?
To my knowledge, she does not accept that at all, no. There have been a number of occasions where she's been given the opportunity, whether that was in the criminal court or in the family court, and she still shows no remorse.
You mentioned about the support that you've had from family and friends. After you made the decision to call for help, you then, I suppose, had to let your family and friends know what had been happening to you for all these years. What was their reaction to that?
Quite horrified in some cases with the level of things that I've had to put up with. Lots of comments like, "I don't think I could have done it. I don't think I would have found the strength." Lots of people have asked me, like we've said earlier, why did you put up with it? But I think it's always been about the family and giving them the best. I didn't want to be a weekend dad. I didn't. Apologies to anybody that is in a family in those circumstances, but I wanted to be able to see my children every morning.
I know that there will be people that have been listening to our conversation that recognise themselves in what they've been hearing, either as the victim or the abuser, perhaps. If there are people listening, men and women, who find themselves in a similar situation to you, what would you say to them?
My first piece of advice is to not lead a secret life. I think people have their own personal lives and they don't necessarily want everybody knowing about it. But if there is something like this, there is abuse going on in your life, the worst thing you can do is not to share it with anybody. You do need to talk to family members and friends, even if you've been estranged from them, through no fault of your own, to maintain that sort of point of contact. Sometimes it's not always easy to talk to immediate friends, so there are agencies out there, and specifically for men, I've found the one that I use was called the Mankind Initiative, and they've got a website, www.mankind.org.uk. They were very supportive as far as I was concerned. I'm also aware of the fact that a new charity has just been set up in Swindon, and it's called Swindon's Voice for Men. And again, they have a website, www.swindonsvoiceformen.org.uk. And I would strongly advise contacting both of those if you need a completely different person to talk to. I'd also say that you need to talk to your employer as well from the very beginning, so keep them in the frame, and you will find that they will support you. And from my personal experience, that's been very much the case. I would also not be shy of trying to reach out to as many agencies as possible. In my case, I needed to use social services in Swindon as well. And by and large, they've been very good. And also, I would go and seek legal advice. Even if you're not thinking about doing anything at this stage, I would seek legal advice, particularly if there is a family involved, if there are children involved.
A harrowing story from Paul Chivers, speaking exclusively to BBC Wiltshire after enduring 10 years of horrific domestic violence at the hands of his wife, who's now serving 16 months in prison. One organisation who did help Paul during and after his ordeal is the Mankind Initiative. Their chairman is Mark Brooks, and I asked him quite how common stories like Paul's are.
Well, it's far more common than you would think. We hear stories like Paul's every day when people call us on our helpline, and each individual case is different. The circumstances, how the domestic abuse and the violence plays out, and also how men find the courage to escape from the situation they're in. Every single person is different, but these stories are common.
Paul, as we heard, suffered for 10 years before he did something to stop it. What's the average time, from your experience, that somebody will put up with this before they say enough?
Well, from our experience and research conducted by the police, the average time before a man actually tries to get help is around 3 years. So Paul left his escape route and how he left the relationship far longer than many others. But nonetheless, 3 years is still a long time in anybody's life. And, we would like to see that period shortened so men can get help immediately and feel that they can escape as soon as they can.
Look, when you talk about domestic violence, there is still that, if you like, stereotype that people instantly think it's the woman that's the victim. Is that still the case?
By and large, it is still the case that when people picture domestic violence, they think it's a female victim and a man carrying out the abuse. But we're finding more and more people are starting to recognise that men can be victims and are victims of domestic abuse, not only in heterosexual relationships, but also in same-sex relationships. And that also counts for women as well. We know that women are victims in same-sex relationships as well. So no longer can we think of domestic abuse as being one-dimensional. Nowadays, it's certainly multi-dimensional.
And what support is there out there for victims of domestic abuse, particularly men?
There are support services out there for men. For example, there's helplines like ours. The police really will support a man if he comes forward. And also, there's a range of what you would call independent domestic violence advisors, which are based in every county, obviously including Wiltshire. And these are people that will actually help a male victim in exactly the same way they would a female victim.
Mark, do we know any statistics, if you like, for the number of men that are coming forward here in Wiltshire as the victim of domestic abuse?
Well, we contact contacted Wiltshire Police last year, and we found that over a 3-year period, on average, 600 men are coming forward to Wiltshire Police each year. So that's about 12 a week.
And for anyone listening to this morning that recognises that they're in a situation similar to the ones that we've been discussing, they are the victim of domestic abuse, what would your advice be to them?
Well, certainly there are helplines out there that will be able to support you. You should go on websites like ours and many others, but also there are independent domestic violence advisors, and of course if you're in immediate danger you must go to the police. There is help out there for you. And
what about contacting the Mankind Initiative? How do we do that?
You can contact our charity on 01823 33 42 44, or go to our website mankind.org.uk, where there's plenty of information there.
Mark Brooks, chairman of the Mankind Initiative. It's just gone 8:15 now.